No one wants to talk about the active shooter. No one wants to change their plan when there's not an attack, because why? It's working perfectly. Every day they don't attack. And then we have a Uvalde or another big attack. And then we go crazy. We wake up, our hair's on fire. The governor's appointing task forces to study it. We're putting candles and teddy bears on fences and crying during the memorial ceremonies. Politicians are pushing their agendas. The media's covering it 24/7. We're buying a bunch of stuff that won't help. And then we pat ourselves on the back and say, this time we did something. And we go back to sleep, hit the snooze button until the next attack. We've been doing that for 40 years, saying we do things, but nothing that would actually help.
If you're new or watching this as a replay, welcome. We're so glad that you're here. Please subscribe to Defenders Live on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and join our group on Facebook as well. And if you don't want to miss another episode, you can sign up for email notifications at defenders-live.com. Ed is the co-owner and instructor at Last Resort Firearms Training in Whitehall, Arkansas. He's been researching, writing, and providing training to schools, churches, and law enforcement on active shooter threats for over a decade. He has experience as a police officer, a school teacher, a firearms trainer, and an Army officer. So Ed has a lot to offer us tonight, and we're so thankful that he has decided to join us. So Ed, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Could you maybe go into more detail about your background, about why you're one of the foremost experts in the field? I think that might be good to talk about.
I don't know about that, but I think one of the things is I got into this for personal reasons. So I don't work for a company. I don't have to push the company's, whatever the company's plan is. A lot of the people that give presentations in law enforcement and education, other places, they inherited the job. So they inherited slides made by somebody else, maybe 3 or 4 people ago. And all they're doing is showing slides that they've heard somebody else. All my stuff I've created myself, and I did it for personal reasons. I got into this a little bit from my experience in the Army, but then when I left the Army, I got into teaching. And I was told by people with master's degrees and PhDs that if an active shooter came in the school where I was a teacher, that my job as the authority figure, as the adult, was to keep all my kids in my room as the shooting and the screaming got closer and closer and closer, not to let them run, not to let them go out the window, but to hold them in the room and wait until the shooter got there to kill them. And it just made absolutely no sense to me. But of course, sometimes things that don't make sense, it's because you don't understand all the parameters. You don't understand all the restrictions and all the backstory. So that's why I got into it, strictly to find out, it seems so obvious that we're doing the exact wrong thing. Yeah. So that's why I started looking into it. So everything I've been doing the last 15 years is studying this from the perspectives of my history. And when I first got into it, I didn't think my military background really had anything to play with it, but it actually does, in how a military officer is trained to look at a potential threat, study it, define it, and then come up with the best possible fighting plan to defeat that enemy as quickly as possible with the fewest amount of casualties. That's the exact methodology we should be bringing to this, but no, we're not.
Okay, great. Do you want me to go ahead and start the slideshow then, Ed?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And hopefully we can do this. So that's it. It's an ugly topic. It's the active shooter. So go ahead. All right. So again, that's my background. So for the last 15 years, and as I move forward, that's the perspectives that I look at this problem with and the experiences that I look at this problem with. Go ahead. I do educational presentations like this. I've only done a handful online because usually there's not enough time. My usual presentations run anywhere from 2 hours to 12 hours, 3 and 4 hours being the norm. So this is going to be very quick. I'm not going to cover any actual attacks because we just don't have time. But I can do a general study presentation, which covers attacks at all different types of locations, or I can focus them on schools. I can focus them on lessons learned for law enforcement from all different types of attacks. I can focus them on churches or businesses. And I can consult with businesses, churches, schools on making their policies, plans, and the training of their staff and their students. And then I conduct live fire training for armed people, whether that's a citizen, a cop, an armed school staff, an armed church member, or anybody else, an armed response to them. Okay. And so we just had one, Michigan State. So it serves as a good example of it's in the news. It's in the news. It's in the news. We hear about it all the time, but very few people understand it because they hear about it, but they're not getting told what they need to get told. There's a lot of distraction. So we have to educate the public on this if we want to get better results. And we really need to focus on preparing the responders to future active shooter attacks. And most people's brains, when they hear responder to an active shooter, they go to a badge, they go to a cop. And what I'm going to clearly show you is cops almost it's impossible for cops to give us low numbers. If they're the ones that respond and stop an active shooter, mathematically, it's almost impossible to get low numbers. So if we want low numbers, which I do, the intended victims are the ones that are going to have to stop this thing. And we need to change most church, school, and business response plans because most of them are bad. Go ahead. We've been failing as a country. We've been failing at active shooter response for about 40 years now. So I just give you some examples up there. There's some schools. I'm going to show you a little bit more about those later. And then there's businesses. And then there's military bases. And we continue to get numbers and kind of notice that they're usually between 20s and 40s. We end up with a victim count of 20, 30, and 40 in a lot of them. And I'm going to show you why, because that is the result that our default system gives us. So it shouldn't be a surprise when we get 20, 30, or 40 shot victims. That is what our default system gives us. The only two areas I have seen some positive movement, some success, not total good, but some success, is churches and law enforcement have been making some positive success. Go ahead. So what I've come to realize is we as a country and organizations within the country, we're focusing on the bookends and ignoring the books, because the bookends are easy to think about and easy to talk about and comfortable. So we focus on what happens, a lot of the stuff that happens before the active shooter shows up and starts his attack, and all the stuff that has to happen after the attack is over. Those are the bookends. What we're not talking about is stopping him quickly within the first 30 seconds of his attack, because that's not comfortable to talk about, because that takes ruthless, vicious violence. And most people, especially if you hadn't been in law enforcement, military, we'd rather talk about mental health. We'd rather talk about see-through backpacks. We'd rather talk about accountability. We'd rather talk about nice stuff and not being viciously violent. And that's the only thing that's going to give us low numbers. Go ahead. So this is not going away. 2020, probably because of COVID, we had a very slow year for active shooters, but the second half of 2022 and now into 2023, we basically had one a month of active shooter attacks. So this is not going away. So we need to fix it. Not fix it. We can't stop it. We can't get to zero. There's no way I know to do that, but there is a very clear way we can bring the numbers down. And bringing the victim count down, it also serves as a deterrent, because if they don't think they can get high numbers, they won't attack. So in my research, in my study, this is what it's part of the military training of defining your opponent, of defining the threat you think you're going to have to fight. This is what I think's happened most often in our country in the last 40 years. It's the only way I know to predict what's most likely to happen in the future. Look at the very top one. The shooter is usually a young male. Well, if you look back at that slide I just showed you, over the last 10 months, half of them are over 30. So yeah, over the last 10 months, that's not fitting the trend. Is that going to mean there's a new trend coming? I don't know. I don't think we've been in it long enough yet. But if you look back over the last 30 years, most of the shooters are young and male. They plan their attack in a gun-free zone, a place where it's illegal for anybody to have a gun. So when they show up with their illegal gun, they're the only ones that have a gun, or they're the only ones that can shoot for a number of minutes. This is not a political thing for them. This is a mathematical thing. They need to be the only one that can shoot for a number of minutes. That will allow them to get the body count high enough to get them the media coverage and the notoriety. Should be no surprise that active shooters that want high body counts don't start their attacks in a police station. They don't start them at NRA conventions, and they don't start them at gun shows. There's nothing preventing them from starting an attack there. It just won't last long enough. They usually have multiple weapons when they start their attack. 2 to 4 seems to be the norm. One of them is usually a long gun, at least one of them. So they start with a long gun, shoot it till it malfunctions, or it's out of ammo. They'll dump it, go to the second gun if they have it, and continue down the line. They usually have large amounts of ammunition. At least 4 have had over 1,000 rounds. These usually last a relatively short time, because eventually somebody will show up to end it. Or in a lot of cases, they just end it themselves. A theory is their adrenaline runs out, and many of them just either stop and leave, stop and give up, or shoot themselves. They don't really have an escape plan, most of them. Now, the mobile attackers sometimes will want to get away to attack a different place, but most of them know when they fire their first round, they're going to end that day in the morgue or in the jail. One of those two places.
Hey, Ed. Hey, do these guys, do they tend to have training? Do they know how to run their weaponry? And do they tend to have reliable weapons?
Well, I don't know about the reliable weapons, but no, thank God they don't tend to be very well trained. So what I say is most of the time, not all the time, most of the time it's a punk that brought dad's gun to school, a punk that brought dad's gun to the mall. So because of that, there's several instances where, a couple instances, they couldn't make the first round come out of the gun, but in a lot of them, we see a lot of malfunctions because they don't know how to run the guns, and they have trouble with reloads. So are they dangerous? Of course they're dangerous, but they're not Navy SEALs. They're not John Wick. They're not Jason Bourne. Okay, yeah, they're an evil punk with a gun, but they're not that hard of an opponent to go up against. And down there at the bottom is the most important thing, and that's math and time. What I find on average is they're going to shoot somebody about every 10 seconds. There's weird outliers. Columbine was exceedingly slow, Dayton and Tucson were extremely fast, but about 70 to 80% in the middle. They're going to come very close to an average of 1 every 10 seconds. So that's what I think has happened most often in the past. So if that's what's most likely to happen in the future, what is the best possible plan we could have in place to have a welcoming party for them when they start their next attack? Go ahead. Yeah, and this one's not going to build. So this is the distraction part. And I think a lot of it's intentional. You know, how part of how a magician is successful in deceiving us is they get us looking at get us distracted, looking at stuff that doesn't matter so they can do their tricks and we don't see it. So what I've got up there is the first thing is emotions. And we've got it right now. We got a bunch of people shot in Michigan State, and there's all kinds of news reports about we're trying to fast track certain legislation because we know when people are emotional, we can get them to agree to stuff that otherwise they wouldn't agree to. So there's nothing wrong with feeling emotions. If a bunch of innocent people get shot, especially if it's kids, but what we don't want to do is base our plans and policies off emotions. But unfortunately, that'll be the push to try to catch people while they're emotional and not logical. The second one is political agendas, and there's no way of stopping political agendas, but we should not make our policies and plans off of political motivations, because not only do we not get plans that help, we get plans that actually hurt. And then the third one is hope, and hope's a beautiful human thing, and I'm not saying don't hope, but we got to get beyond hope. Hope, there's never another attack, but if you're not planning like he's coming tomorrow, you're not adequately planning. And we all understand this. Tonight, I'm going to go to bed. I hope I don't have a home invasion, but I'm still locking my doors. When I drive, I hope a drunk driver doesn't smack into me, but I still put my seatbelt on. So everybody, we hope, but hope doesn't always give us success. So we've got a plan in case hope fails. And the only thing that really matters that's not a distraction is math and time. Very simple math and time. It's even math I can do. So that's the whole thing about this is looking at math and time. So go ahead.
So Ed, back to the math and time.
Yeah.
When you said on average about one person per 10 seconds is shot, do you mean injuries or do you mean fatalities?
We're going to get into more detail on that. Now, it's shot. Fatalities, there's too many variables. There are active shootings where almost nobody died, and there's active shootings where everybody died. It depends on what type of weapon, how many times he shoots them, how big or small they are. So the mortality rate of wounded versus killed, there's no way to predict that I know of. But how many people get shot, there's a way to get very close, I think. So, okay, 1 every 10 seconds, that's a broad average planning factor, but you can actually get more specific, and we should. How you get 1 every 10 seconds is every time you study an attack, you put how long the attack lasted in the numerator. So on the slide there, I got 300 seconds. That's a 5-minute attack. This is just an example. And then, so for every attack that you study, you put the time from first shot on victim to last shot on victim on the top, and you divide it by how many people did he shoot during that attack. And most of them come out right around 1 every 10 seconds. And that sounds bad, or 1 every 10 seconds or 6 every minute. But it's actually quite a bit worse than that, because he's not going to shoot at a very steady rate throughout his entire attack. He's going to start in a very crowded place. He's going to be able to shoot new people very rapid, probably every 2 to 3 to 4 seconds. But later in the attack, when it's harder to find new victims, he's only shooting them at every 20 or 30 seconds. So it's not a steady state. The first 2 or 3 minutes of the attack are going to be far worse. Mathematical thing up there, dividing by the number of people shot, it's not dividing by the number of bullet holes. And most active shooters shoot their victims multiple times. So bullets are hitting flesh much more rapidly than 1 every 10 seconds. So this is how you use the mathematical planning factor. The top there that I have the red lines through the numbers, that's the unrealistic 1 every 1 every 10 seconds. But then if you front load it to what it actually looks like, if you let him shoot for a minute, the average you can expect is to have 12 people shot by the end of that first minute. The Parkland shooter shot 14 in his first minute. If you let him shoot to 2 minutes and you stop him at the end of 2 minutes, you can expect around 19 or 20, depending on how aggressive he is. If you let him shoot to 3 minutes, you're probably looking at 20 to 24. If you let him shoot to 4 minutes, you're looking close to 30. So that helps us understand why we continue to get 20s, 30s, and 40s in the victim. The only way, mathematically, the only way to get low numbers is to stop him well within the first minute. I just say within the first 30 seconds. I'm not telling you there's 5 ways to do it, and this is my preferred way. There is only one mathematical way to have not a guarantee, but a very good chance of low numbers, and that's to stop him in the first 30 seconds. Because if you don't, every few seconds after that, he's shooting new people in the victim counts. What's the maximum number of dead and wounded victims that we're willing to have? Now, I'm not asking what do you want, what do you hope for, what do you pray for? I'm asking what's the maximum acceptable number. This is absolutely second nature in the military. In fact, it's required in the military to do casualty estimations. But what I found when I got into this after I left the military was civilians are not used to it. They don't want to do it. It's uncomfortable. They'd rather talk about see-through backpacks and panic buttons and stuff that's nice. What's there on the bottom is what's killing us is time. So how many people are you willing to have shot while you wait on all these things that have to take place? Somebody has to call 911, and there's on average 1 to 4 minutes between the first shot of an attack and the first 911 call. 1 to 4 minutes. The fastest I know of is 46 seconds, and that was Fairchild Air Force. And all that time, we're waiting on somebody to access their phone and calls. People are getting shot. Well, then a 911 operator has to listen to that call, understand it enough. That takes time, and people are getting shot. And then that dispatcher pushes a radio button and tells every cop on dispatch that we've got a shooting that they just got a phone call about. That takes time. Now cops just heard about it, so they got to travel there. That takes time. People are getting shot. Then once they get there, they got to enter, because these attacks usually either start in a building or they transition in. And then once the cop gets in the building, they have to aggress on, close the distance, and stop the active shooter. And that could be immediate, or it could take several hours. It depends on the situation. Go ahead. A lot of times when I ask this question to most audiences, I'll hear them say 0. 0 is the only acceptable number. And I'd say, see, you're stuck on hope. I hope for 0. I pray for 0. I want 0, but I know of no way if he shows up and starts shooting to get 0. So leaders have to grow up and get beyond 0 and beyond hope. But I still run in when I'll talk to superintendents and principals at school. If an active shooter starts here in your school, how many victims do you think you'll have? Well, I hope not many. Whoa, time out. That's what kids do. We got to get beyond that. We got to start planning. If an active shooter starts here, how long will the attack last, Mr. Superintendent? Well, I hope not long. Well, we got to get beyond hope, and we got to start planning. Go ahead, please.
Ed, to jump in here, this tells me that those of us who have decided if this day ever comes, we're going to act. That means we've got to be switched on so quickly that from the moment of just nothing going on to literally be able to go into that defensive life mode, that's a very fast decision that leads to action, which means you got to pre-think through the decisions ahead of time and make that kind of right with your soul and your God way ahead of time.
Yeah, you got to make sure you're okay with it. But when I do my live fire training, again, I've never been in an active shooter scenario or a real live shooter attack. But as I've mentally rehearsed it, war gamed it, researched it, I think it'll be terrifying and stressful, but I think it'll be extremely simple. There's one person in a public place shooting a gun at people. I think that's going to stand out. Now, what I tell my students, what I think it's going to be, if it doesn't start within my vision, I think it's going to be very confusing and stressful until I find it. As we call it clutter. Clutter is everything your brain has to process that's not the shooter. Every person, every piece of furniture, every sound, every smell, as your brain's processing it, it's deselection. I think as I'm moving towards the evidence, the sounds, the screams, whatever, I'm not the problem, not the problem, not the problem, not the problem. And then problem. And I think once I find a guy in a public place shooting people, I think that'll be pretty easy. But yeah, you need to make the decision if you're going to fight or not. And it might be the right decision for any individual. And we'll get to that later. Everybody doesn't have to fight, but somebody has to fight. Did my slide? There we go. All right. So we have to treat this like combat. I get resistance on this. I had a career in the military, and they know that. And they'll say, Ed, you're going back to your old life. This isn't combat. This is a school. And I say, no, it was a school until the first shot was fired. Ed, this isn't combat. This is a house of God. This is a church. It's a church building. But when the first shot fired, it's no longer a church, it's a combat zone. So we have to treat it like, in combat, we expect casualties. We estimate casualties. We plan to minimize casualties. So that's what we have to do here. The problem here is it starts as one-way combat, where only one of the two sides is shooting. That is his plan. That's the whole reason he came here, was so that he could be the only one to shoot for a number of minutes to get his body. The question is very simple. How quickly do we interdict his plan? If we let it stay his plan, where he's the only one that can shoot for a number of minutes, we're going to have our body. But if we quickly turn it into two-way combat, then we have a good chance, not a guarantee, to get low numbers. Go ahead. So again, this would normally build, I apologize, if you start on the left, the first shot. So this shows why we get 20, 30s, and 40s commonly in the victim count, and why our default system gives us that. And so we have to change the default system unless we want to keep getting the same numbers. He walks in with his gun, or he pulls it out wherever he is, and he shoots his first person. Our victim count is now at 1. That's only going to go up, and time's only going to move forward. I told you there's a 1 to 4 minute delay between the first shot and the first 911 call. In this example, I made it 1.5 minutes, which is fairly quick. So this is absolutely crucial there. On the first 911 call, about 1.5 minutes in, and we're already using the planning factors, we're already at 16 victims. So for any organization, a church, a school, or a business, if their plan to stop an active shooter requires a 911 call to stop the shooter, they're guaranteed to have double-digit victims, mathematically. Now, how many will it end up being? 20, 50? I don't know. Too many variables. But I know for a fact it'll be past 10, because he will have already shot 10 before the first person makes his 911. I think I used about 30 seconds for the 911 operator to answer it, tell him to calm down and stop screaming, and understand enough to push a radio button. So now at about a little over 2 minute mark, 2.5 minutes, every cop on dispatch is now getting told we have a shooting at XYZ location. By that time, we're already past 20. It's not the cop's fault. They just heard about it. They can't unshoot the 20 people that got shot before they got the radio call. And the cops really can't help the next several that are going to get shot while they travel there. So there on the slide, you'll see police response time. And people that never been in law enforcement probably don't know that term starts when the cops get the radio call. It doesn't start when the incident started. The first shot, minutes before. Police response time starts when they got the call, and it ends when they pull in the parking lot. It doesn't include everything that happens after they arrive on scene. So I made this pretty generous. I made it the famous 3-minute response time. And if you're in a city municipality, you might get that from a city police department. But if your church, business, or school is out in the county and you're waiting on a deputy or a trooper, that could be a very long time. So with a 3-minute response time, cops showing up 3 minutes after he or she got the radio report, they pull in the parking lot and we're already past 30. That's why we routinely get high 20s, 30s, and 40s for a victim count, because that's what our system is designed to give us. And in this example on the slide, the cop does exactly what we would like, gets out of the vehicle, finds an entrance, gets in the building, closes the distance, and stops the shooter. So we have stopped the shooter. We just stopped him way too late. And nobody did anything wrong. If you look at that slide, that's our system. Everybody did what we expect them to do, and it gives us high numbers. So we got to change our system. The only way I know to change it again is to take what worked. If you look to the far right, the attack ends because the cop got in there and stopped it. But you have to take that and move it back down the timeline. Look up in the top left of the slide. You have to have somebody present. And by present, my definition of that is the person has to be close enough to hear or see the first shot, which means an intended victim, somebody who was there close enough to hear or see the first shot. And why that's magic is if the person that stops it is close enough to hear or see the first shot, we do not need a 911 call, a radio dispatch, and police travel time or police entry. All that stuff that takes all that time that kills us, we don't need. We can end it in the first 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Hey, Ed, you and I, between the two of us, we have 2 decades or so of law enforcement between the two of us. There's no way in the world that a cop's going to be there in 3 minutes, right? There's just,
well, no, there is.
I know you said it's generous, but there's no way.
No, they're in 3 minutes from when they were called, not 3 minutes from the start, but response time, that means from when they were called.
Even from then, I would tell you it's 5, 7, 8 minutes based on my experience.
Usually. But even if everything works great, Andy Brown at Fairchild Air Force, the 911 call was the quickest I know of. Dispatch pushed it out. He got there and shot the guy at about, I think, 2 minutes, 36 seconds, but it was still in the 20s. So if the person that stops them isn't there close enough to hear it or see it, then you're going to have, mathematically, it's not the cop's fault, it's the system's fault. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So we've only had 5 multiple shooter attacks in our country. So over 90% chance it's going to be one shooter. All the ones in the last 10 months have been one shooter. But even if there is just one shooter, there's 2 enemies. And that second enemy pops his head up as soon as the shooter shoots his first round. And that's the clock. And that's the enemy that no one is paying attention to. That's the enemy. No one. It's not enough for your plan to stop the active shooter. They will all stop. No one wants their house to catch on fire. And they call the fire department and say, my house is on fire. Come put it out. And they say, well, just let it burn. It'll go out eventually. I mean, if all you want the fire to do is go out, let it burn because it'll eventually go out. No, we want it out now. So down there at the bottom, I was just up assisting 2 schools up in Iowa because they have decided to go armed. And in one of them, the city police chief wrote a letter against the school deciding to go armed. And one of his big reasons was, hey, listen, we have a tri-county, a multiple county SWAT team, and they are highly trained and highly equipped. And there's no way we can expect people in the school to be as highly trained and highly equipped as a SWAT team. So we shouldn't arm anybody in the school. And I'm like, no, there's no way we can expect the calculus teacher to be as well trained or well armed as SWAT. But what you left out was the second threat, the clock. How quickly can you get this highly trained SWAT team from 3 different counties assembled into the school? Well, by the time you do that, if it's still going on, you're going to have an extremely high body count. So I keep running into that where no one's looking at the clock. It's not enough to stop it. We got to stop it quick. So how do we stop him quickly? There's only 3 ways I know to do it. One is to shoot him down. That works extremely well. It's got a good track record. The second way is by threatening him, by confronting him with deadly force, he decides to shoot himself, which happens quite a bit. That works extremely well. Or if the person there that's going to fight him doesn't have a gun, then he fights him unarmed. Doesn't work nearly as well as with a gun, but it can work. So if I know I'm talking to a group like a school, most schools are not going to have armed staff. If I'm talking to them, I highlight and go through school attacks where unarmed students and staff fought back successfully. So either of those ways will work. Once we stop the active shooter, we also stop the clock, which is a beautiful thing, and that does 3 wonderful things. Go to the next slide. Once we stop the shooter in the clock, 3 things happen. He will not shoot any new people, so the victim count will not go up. He will not reshoot people he's already shot, which happens quite a bit. So they have a better chance of surviving because they don't have as many bullet holes. And now we can get the magic, the wonderful magic of emergency medicine in to treat and evacuate the few people that we let him shoot before we stopped him, so they have a better chance. And they don't bleed out for 3 hours on the floor like they did at Pulse nightclub. Go ahead. All right, so you asked me to focus a little bit on schools and churches. So schools differ in a lot of ways, but even among schools, they differ. High school shootings are far more than half of all school shootings. So high schools are statistically much more likely to have an attack than middle and elementary. But High schools, the shooter is a student or a recent student, meaning the shooter at that attack is a student or someone who dropped out, got expelled, or graduated within the last 12 months. It's most likely to start in the cafeteria before school, the cafeteria during lunch, or the front office entrance area of the school, followed second by hallways and classrooms. Middle schools, the shooter, again, is most likely a student. I only know of one exception to that. What I don't understand is I don't have any middle school shootings that started in the cafeteria, even though every middle school I know of has a cafeteria. That those shooters don't start there. They start most often in the hallway and classroom, followed by outside the school. If it's a middle or high school shooting, you have a slightly higher chance of multiple shooters. Slightly. We've only had 5 multiple shooter attacks in our country, but 3 of those 5 were middle and high school students shooting up their own school. Elementary school is a different animal. The shooter is not a student. Now, we just had one a couple of months ago. It's not an active shooter. It was one elementary student with a gun that shot one teacher. That wasn't an active shooter trying to get a body count. That was one person shooting another person. In Arkansas, that's an aggravated battery. Okay, but in elementary active shooters, they're not related to the school. They're an outsider. They're not a student. They're not a parent. They're not a staff member. So it's not going to start in your cafeteria where one of your kids in the cafeteria start shooting. They're going to start either as they shoot their way into your school because they're an outsider, or they're going to shoot your kids on the playground because the elementary school has an additional tactical problem with the playground that the others don't have. That's happened 3 times. And I sometimes have issues when I'm working with superintendents. They want to treat all the schools the same so they don't appear to be playing favorites when we should not treat them the same. If we talk about hardening the buildings, which is another thing people like to talk about because it's not as hard to talk about locks and doors as it is being ruthlessly violent against this attack. So we're going to get these new locks and these new doors. Well, for a middle or a high school, hardening the building, make it harder to get in the buildings, probably only going to have the negative effect of delaying cops and ambulances because your shooter is already in the school. He's one of your students. He's already in there. So hardening the outside is just going to probably keep the good people out. I only know of one active shooter that attacked a school that had body armor, and that was kind of a weird one because his grandfather was a police officer. He killed his grandfather before the attack and brought his grandfather's police guns and police vest. So I'm not saying it can't happen, but statistically, far less likely than another active shooter for a school shooter to have a vest. So first, look at the bottom. Look at the quotes. Henry Ford said, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And Mark Twain said, there is nothing to be learned in the second kick of the mule. 1989, an elementary school in Stockton, California, Cleveland Elementary. Nutcase went to that school, shot 35 people. And the only reason he didn't shoot more than 35 was he just decided to quit, clocked himself out. Cops weren't on him yet. He could have ran that thing up in the 40s or 50s. What was their plan if an active shooter showed up? It was to call 911 and wait on somebody else to come fix the problem. You would think logically, other school leaders would go, wow, that plan failed miserably. I don't want those numbers if he comes here, so we're going to have a different plan. But everybody kept that plan. So we had 10 years to do something different, but we didn't. So then 1999, Littleton, Colorado, which is Columbine, 2 students went to that school and shot 34, almost the same number, and it should have been in the hundreds. But they were lackadaisical, they were very slow, non-aggressive, and they, again, just decided after 34, they decided to commit suicide. Cops didn't get to their bodies for over 2 hours. So that could have been much worse. What was Columbine's plan? Well, have a school resource officer, have a cop somewhere on this huge campus and call 911 if an active shooter comes and wait on somebody else to come fix this problem. Then we had Sandy Hook in 2012. What was their plan? Their plan was the Columbine plan and the Stockton plan. So the guy came there and shot 28. And then we had Parkland in 2018. What was their plan? Well, it was the same plan Columbine. Have an SRO, a cop, somewhere on this big campus. And if an active shooter starts, somebody get to a phone and call 911 and wait on that process for somebody to come stop him. And they got 34, the same as Columbine. And then just 3 months after Parkland, we had Sandy Hook. They had 2 cops. 2 uniformed cops on campus. But their plan was to call 911 because the shooter very rarely starts his attack right in front of the cop that's on campus. And then we just had Uvalde, which is Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas. What was Robb Elementary in 2002? What was their plan given this history? Well, if an active shooter shows up, call 911 and wait on somebody else to come fix this thing. So we won't have the second kick of the mule. We're on like the 50th kick of the mule. And we keep walking behind the mule. We're not learning the lessons. Go ahead. So churches, the attack most often starts in the parking lot. That's probably the most critical thing for churches to understand. So if they're serious about this, they have to have security in the parking lot. And I'm not talking about just a camera. They have to have people in the parking lot. If they can identify the attacker out there and stop him out there, there's a great chance of a low victim count. They let him get in the building. It's a lot more complex problem. The shooter is not a member or an attender. It's an outsider. Now, he may have been to the church 1, 2, or 3 times before for one of 2 reasons, either asking for handouts, which has happened a couple of times, or They pretend to be interested in joining the church. All they're doing is reconning. Down there at the bottom, having armed church members there as a welcoming party for the active shooter when he shows up has worked 100% of the time. Now, that's only 2, but it's 100% of 2. It's 2 of 2. It's got a great track record so far. Go ahead. The problem is what I see is everybody's planning for the day, all the days, every day that the shooter doesn't show up. Any plan you could dream up, type up, copy off the internet. And that's why you see things like lockdown drills and run, hide, fight. And all these things, they work great. When you're drilling them, when the active shooter's not there, they work perfect. And they're easy to type and they're easy to drill. We're not making plans for the day the active shooter shows up because that is ugly to think about and it's more complex. And it requires violence if we want a low number. Go ahead. So everybody remembers Alice in Wonderland. I think cute little girl walking through the woods on a path. She comes to a point where the path splits and goes in 2 directions. And there happens to be a cat there. And she asked the cat, which of these paths should I take? And the cat says, well, where is it you're trying to get to? And she goes, I really don't know. So the cat says, well, then either path will work for you, won't it? If you don't know where you're trying to get to, any road will take you there. And that's the problem we have. Again, school superintendent, what's the maximum number of kids to be shot in your school? Well, I hope not many. We're not making a plan that we work towards. We're just hoping, and that's what we got to do. We got to set it. A low victim count. My recommendation to everybody is single-digit victims. It is attainable. It is achievable. I cannot give you a plan for 0, but actually single digits includes 0. It's 0 to 9. But I can get you a plan that has an extremely high success rate of getting single digits. So that should be our goal. And everything in our does it go in our plan? Does it not go in our plan? Well, does it help us get single-digit victims? Yes or no? It's very simple. If it doesn't help us get our goal, we always keep our goal in mind. Go ahead. So I only know of 3 options out there for any organization, church, school, or business. I only know of 3 possible options. One is call 911 and wait, and that's what most of them have. That's what most of them have had. 2 is have a cop somewhere on the property, an SRO for a school. Some churches hire off-duty cops. Businesses hire off-duty cops. And number 3 is just let the people who are already there defend themselves. And those are the only 3 options I know of that exist. And it doesn't matter which one of those 3 an organization picks. They all work equally well and give you the same outcome on any day, except the day the active shooter shows up. On that day, there's drastically different results. Go ahead. That's an example or some samples of call 911 and wait. And that's what I've been and we know this. And still that's the majority of plans for schools and businesses and still some churches. If those numbers are unacceptable to me, why as a leader would I purposely choose a plan that gets me those numbers? Go ahead. And they'll say, yeah, but I've talked to police chief or the sheriff. He says they can get cops here pretty quick. Well, that's pretty quick after they get the radio call when you're already past 20 people. So are you good with having over 20 people shot? Well, no. Well, then it doesn't matter how quick the cops can get here. You got to do it. Next, very hard to find one. Michigan State one is below 10, but that's only because he shot at one place left on his own. It wasn't because the cops got there and stopped him before he could get past 10. The only way mathematically is for the people there to stop it. Go ahead. Option 2, having cops on site. Uniformed cops have some deterrent value, but you can't measure it. But what I can tell you guaranteed is having uniformed cops on site is not a guarantee they won't attack, and it's not a guarantee if they do attack, you'll have low numbers. I always recommend option 3 of the 3 available, and I'll get, that's because you're a gun guy. But it has nothing to do with politics. It has nothing to do with my hobbies. It has everything to do with math, time, and data. When a good person with a gun was close enough to see or hear the first shot and aggressively act against the active shooter, we have single-digit victims 90% of the time. I'm willing to look at any other methodology of responding to this that has a 90% success rate of single-digit victims. Please contact. Armed citizens have never shot the wrong person responding to an active shooter. Cops have multiple times. Cops have accidentally shot and killed each other by mistake responding to active shooters twice. Borderline Bar and Grill in California and St. George County, Maryland. But then people go to the politics and the emotion. They knee-jerk, oh, God, we can't do that. Why can't we do that? You're suggesting somebody with no police training at all can go up against these evil mad dog killers. Well, I'm not suggesting it. I'm saying it's happened. It's not hypothetically that I think they possibly could. They have. It's just data. Go ahead. That's 18 of the 20 times where an active shooter attacked and somebody, a good person carrying a gun or had a gun very close by, was close enough to hear or see the attack start and acted aggressively and stopped it. If you see 1 blue asterisk to the right of the attack, that's a uniformed cop. If you see 2 blue asterisks, it's an off-duty cop. If you see no blue asterisks, it's just an armed citizen. Armed citizens are more successful at stopping active shooter attacks early with a low body count than cops are. Is that because they're better than cops? No, it's because they're there and cops aren't. It's all about time and math and where you are. It doesn't matter where you have a badge or a blue shirt or a brown shirt. It shouldn't be surprising that active shooters are a subset of violent criminals, and violent criminals tend to go out of their way not to start their attack right in front of a uniformed cop. So if you put the armed citizens and the off-duty cops together, that's 13 of the 18. The shooter had no way of knowing there was anybody there that could fight him when he started. And the few uniformed cops there, they weren't right in front of him. They were around the corner in the next room that the shooter didn't know when they started. Just bad luck for them. Go ahead. So I've been doing this for so long, I already know the arguments I'm going to get. For schools, guns on campus is a bad idea. It's just too dangerous. Okay, do you have an SRO? Does he or she carry a gun? Well, yeah, of course. So guns aren't a bad thing. It's just a matter of who's got them. So you don't want guns on campus. Who are you going to call if an active shooter shows up? Somebody with a gun. So I know, everybody knows when an active shooter shows up, the best way to stop him is somebody with a gun. If he's not here, if the good person that's going to stop him with a gun isn't here, he's 5, 8, 12 minutes away, and that's going to be a high body count. It's all about time and math. If you don't have anybody here with a gun, then you have two alternatives. Fight him unarmed, which is what you got to do, or watch him get a high body count. School employees don't have police training. Well, they don't need police training. We just had another Eli Dickin in Indiana, a 22-year-old guy with no military experience, no law enforcement experience, and no formal professional gun training. His granddad taught him how to shoot a handgun when he was little, happened to be at the mall when it started, stopped it in 15 seconds. Counter that with the Parkland school resource officer had over 30 years of law enforcement experience and training, and that didn't really help out much because he wasn't there when it started, and then he didn't go in. Arming teachers is a stupid idea. That's the terminology that they get away with using. And actually, I'm not talking about just teachers. I'm talking about custodians, cafeteria workers, counselors, anybody, not just teachers. And we're not arming them. We're just going to stop disarming. We're not giving them a gun. We're just going to stop telling them they can't bring the gun they carry everywhere else onto campus. You shouldn't burden teachers with this additional task. And this is where the fact that I taught school helps me. Yeah, you're not burdening them if they're volunteers. Teachers are too busy. They got too much to do. And they do up until the first shot's fired. They're not teaching anymore. Everybody's job is the same once the first shot fired, and that's saving lives. And there's no better way to do that than stopping the active shooter. And then armed staff will get shot by responding police. That's the one they always say. It's extremely unlikely mathematically because if you stop it in the first 30 seconds, you'll be on your third cigarette by the time the first cop shows up. That's not an insult to the cop. That's an insult to the system which brings the cop to us. Go ahead. And that's what I get. No, Ed, we're not going to arm the staff of the school. Okay, then what's your plan for single-digit victims? Well, it's not yours. I'll tell you that. Okay, got it. Still love you. We disagree. So tell me your plan. Well, it's not what you want. Okay, but they don't have a plan. All they've got is a problem with the only plan that math shows us has a good chance of getting us low numbers. Go ahead. So that's the cycle we're in. No one wants to talk about the active shooter. No one wants to change their plan when when there's not an attack because why? It's working perfectly. Every day they don't attack. And then we have a Uvalde or another big attack. And then we go crazy. We wake up. Our hair's on fire. The governor's appointing task forces to study it. We're putting candles and teddy bears on trees, fences and crying during the memorial ceremonies. Politicians are pushing their agendas. The media is covering it 24/7. We're buying a bunch of stuff that won't help. And then we pat ourselves on the back and say, this time we did something. And we go back to sleep, hit the snooze button until the next attack. We've been doing that for 40 years, saying we do things, but nothing that would actually help. Go ahead. So individually, everybody has three options. The federal government for decades, and Alice says, run, hide, fight. Don't like that. I say fight, flee, barricade, and not just to jumble the words around, but fight is the very first thing. There's really only two choices, fight and flee. Barricade is what you do if you don't have a choice. But when I go to schools, their first thing is to barricade. No, that's the worst thing to do. If you can do one of the other two, do the other two. Fighting is best for humanity because the quicker somebody fights and stops this guy, the lower the victim count will be. That's better for humanity, a low victim count. Everybody doesn't have to fight, but somebody has to. If you cannot fight or will not fight, then flee. Get away. If you're not going to fight evil, then get away from evil as fast as you can by any way necessary. So again, fight and flee is your two choices. Only barricade if you're unable to do those two things. So what I have, especially with schools, but everybody else, Jerry Seinfeld on his show talked about bizarro world, and there's opposite day. That means on this day, everything's different than on every other day. And when the active shooter shows up, it's opposite. What we normally prohibit, we now not only allow, but we encourage violence. And I'm talking about ruthless, vicious, deadly, disabling violence. Not a loose tooth, not a fat lip, vicious, ruthless violence. Any other day you do that, going to get in trouble. But on this day, saves lives. Breaking windows on any other day, don't do that. On this day, do it. Leaving campus, running off campus without permission, don't do that on any other day, but on this day, it's a good thing to do. And just breaking rules and period. If we're in a store the other day that had a sign that said employees only beyond this point, well, I'm going to follow that rule any other day. But on this day, I'm going to go through that door if I determine that's the safest thing for me. Fire alarms, don't pull them on every day there's not a fire, but we want people pulling them on days there's fire. What's important on all other days is not important. Like in a school, accountability, discipline, following the rules. Yeah, on every other day, those are important. This day, accountability is not important. That's what schools want to focus on because it's easy. Accountability will happen. You don't have to try to make it happen. All the kids want to be found. All the parents want to find them. They all got phones. That'll happen. And then once the first shot's fired, everybody's job is to save lives. It's not sweeping the floor if you're a custodian. It's not cooking if you're a cafeteria worker. It's not teaching if you're a teacher. Everybody's job is to save lives. And like Tim Larkin said, violence is almost never the correct answer. But rarely it is the only answer. And on this day, I would argue it is. Go ahead. I keep wanting to hit the button. So this is my goal. And I would love if the country and at least organizations would take it. Single digit victims. That should be the goal. How can we accomplish that? I only know of one way. And that's an immediate counterattack that stops him in the first 30 seconds. How can that be done? I only know of two ways, with a gun and without a gun. They can both work. One is a heck of a lot easier. You can cut grass with a pair of scissors. You can cut grass with a rotary mechanical push mower. You can cut grass with a power push mower. And you can cut grass with a zero turn mower. They will all cut the grass, but you get to choose how efficient of a tool you want to use to get the task done. I think we ought to do the same thing with stopping the active shooter, because cutting grass is far less important than keeping the victim count. So everybody likes a slide with summary. Math and time, not any of the other crap they distract us with. Math and time. Every few seconds, someone's getting shot, so fighting quickly is the only way we're going to have low victims. And I haven't met anybody yet that says, no, I want high victims. Everybody wants low victims, but they're just not willing to take the steps that has a good chance of getting that. We got to do a 180-degree turn. This isn't a slight modification. This is a complete about face from waiting for somebody to come stop it to we're going to stop it. The words aren't that much difference, but the actions. Armed, present, and willing gives us our best chance. Somebody is armed, close enough to hear it or see it, and they're willing to act. That has great success rate. The active shooter can only get a high victim count if we let him get a high victim count. We got to stop letting him. Individual plans and organizational plans that take charge of the situation and stop his plan. Go ahead. So that's my info. Again, so my email's up there, my phone number's up there. Call, text if you think I can help you or in any way. I appreciate y'all having me on.
Is that your last slide? I assume it is.
Yeah, okay. That's it. Okay. It's very frustrating passion of mine for the last 15 years. We got to start doing something different. It's just frustrating that every time there's a shooting, we act unacceptable, but then we don't do anything to change it. It's frustrating.
Mm-hmm. So this question is from Kara. Have you seen any schools change their mind on armed staff once they understand the math problem? Is the needle moving at all, or do they have you out and then they still rely on 911?
Well, both. No, I've seen, again, Iowa, once they changed their laws, there's some very brave people up there. And I'm talking about the superintendent, 100% of the school board, all the principals are behind it. Private schools, that's where I've seen the most movement, but that's one of the reasons is in a lot of states, they don't have the political, legal barriers or hurdles they have to jump through that public schools do. So I'm seeing quite a few changes, but I will also say schools that just need to check the block. Hey, state requires us to do active shooter training. We know that Monk guy will do it. Bring him in here. Let him say whatever he wants to say. We'll check the block, report to state that we've met the standard and move on. So I see both, but I am starting to see some that know that if the numbers are going to be low, it's only if we take charge of this and have a plan for it.
Do you see more and more churches picking this up? I mean, you do a lot of training in churches too. We've done some. Yep. Your program is definitely extremely comprehensive. Are you seeing more movement in the church community?
A lot. Well, yeah, that's when I said, early on, I have seen some progress in churches and law enforcement. So in my very limited exposure experience, the Sutherland Springs church attack, where the guy went in that Texas church and shot 46 of the 50 people in there. Up until that point, when I talked to churches, about 80% of them were like, yeah, we're not there yet. We're not ready. After that, it flipped. 80% of the churches I talked to after that were like, we have an armed team. We're forming an armed team, or we want to come help us. They're serious. But again, in most states, most churches don't have the legal, political hoops or barriers that public schools do.
Heather wants to know if you're familiar with bullets both ways.
No, never heard of it.
She says, I think their focus is on arming faculty. And one of the organizers was a student at Columbine.
Never heard of it. But I'll tell you, having a cop there is not a magic fix. By the same token, having armed staff is not a magic fix. So some of the schools I've worked with, I train several here in Arkansas every year, but some schools treat it like a good old boys network. Yeah, we got 4, we're big school district, high school, a middle school, 4 elementaries. We got 4 people armed, and they're all up in the administration building. Mathematically, that's not going to help somebody hear it or see it. They're not on the playgrounds and the cafeterias and the front offices of these buildings where they start. So just having armed staff is not good enough. You have to have armed people down in the areas where these are most likely to start and have enough of them to where there's redundancy and they can get to them within the first 30 seconds.
Awesome. Well, we're over the hour. Adam, did you have anything?
As I was listening to you, it just goes over and over to the message of our company, Defenders USA, is just you really have to build that heart set, the mindset of being able to switch on as the defender, right? Be the thing that evil fears. And you've got to be willing to do that and switch it on immediately if you're the one who's chosen to defend or to fight. And that's a big process. That's a big emotional leap for a lot of people, yet it's so needed. And just you're talking about that just pounds that in like a nail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a lot of the armed citizens, because I've met several of them that have stopped these things, they weren't They weren't Navy SEALs. They weren't highly trained SWAT operators. David George was a pastor of a church in the Olympia, Washington area. That Eli Dickens, 22-year-old, I'm not going to say kid, he's but 22-year-old guy in the mall. So I'm all about training. I make money giving training. I spend money going to training. But really, are you armed? Are you there? And are you willing? Those three things are get you 80 to 90% there. Are you armed? Are you willing? And are you there? And that has just a great success rate, even if you're not highly trained or don't have military or law enforcement experience.
So to the audience here that's listening, I had the honor of meeting Ed in a Ranger Master course, his range in Arkansas, probably 2 or so years ago. And I was just extremely impressed, not only with his skill level, but the thoughtfulness with what he's doing, the depth that he's gone to. And if there's any way we can ever get you to bring Ed to your places, to your facilities, or you go get training with him, I think it behooves you well to do it. It benefits you, and more importantly, probably those you love. So if you ever get the chance to train with Ed, you need to take that chance if you can.
We appreciate you taking the time with us tonight. Guys, go to Last Resort Firearms Training on Facebook, look up Ed, and reach out to him if you want to bring him to your area.